find yourselves basking in the afterglow of Christmas? Yeah, some yes, some no. If you have kids at home, if your work schedule is modified, even if you're not working, maybe especially, there's a tendency to think to ourselves, wow, I hope this never ends. But of course it does. We might find ourselves wishing if only the whole year could be like this. Anybody wish that sometimes on a kid? Yeah. When you think about the mayhem that seems to lead up to Christmas, the holidays, the 2 weeks are such a welcome relief. But we all know we can't do that. And the answer really is pretty straightforward if we can kind of get out of the dreamy stupor that oftentimes accompany the holidays and realize that Jesus went on to live his life. He lived his life into the will that God had for him. And that's really what we are called to do. And in a way that is not so different from the way in which Jesus lived into the will and purpose of God for his life. The birth of Jesus was just the beginning, just as the birth of Jesus in our own hearts and lives is the beginning of a lifetime, literally. No matter how young or how old we are always on the journey of becoming more Christ-like. That's one of the beauties of the gospel. We really are all on the journey together. Jesus began living into his purpose. We need to do the same, but the question is always, what is that purpose? Well, there are a lot of places, especially in the Gospels, where we can read Jesus' own understanding of his purpose in relation to God. But this morning's reading from the Gospel of Mark is certainly one of the clearest and most foundational. Jesus understood himself in the context of that reading to be a servant leader. Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, in part says, "For the Son of Man, speaking of himself, he said, I came not to be served, but to serve. I came not to be served, but to serve." He understood his life's purpose as determined really by God to be a life of service. Jesus didn't intend to say, however, that there's anything wrong with aspiring to greatness. Nor did he intend to say that a life of service means that we are to live our lives as everybody else's doormat. And there are some people who kind of distort Christianity into a kind of a doormat understanding of what it means to live a life. It's neither of those things. It's not a doormat because when we say our purpose is to serve, our service is first rendered to God. We become servants of God. And having chosen to be servants of God, we then take our life's work from God's will to us. And so there are balances, and it becomes a matter of discerning. How would God have me be Christ-like in this situation? It does not mean that we have to say yes to everything everybody asks of us. And as far as aspiring to greatness, Jesus has no qualms with that. It's just that he turns greatness on its head. For Jesus, greatness is not demonstrated by wielding authority to our own advantage and benefit. For Jesus, greatness is about utilizing that authority that we have as children of God on behalf of other people. If you read any book about Mother Teresa, you'll read about the greatness of servant leadership. A theologian of the mid-20th century that Jim and I both enjoy reading and quoting was named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And he spoke of Jesus as the man for others. It's foundational to Bonhoeffer's theology. And it's not a bad way to think about our ministry, our mission, our vocation, to be men and women in service to God on behalf of other people. We've all heard quotes that say, the only hands and feet God have on earth are those that we have. And that's true. We're called to demonstrate the work of God in this world as servants of God on behalf of other people. Servant leadership, as demonstrated by Jesus, is not unique to him, but as in Jesus' entire life, it is exemplified in him that we might understand the goal to which we aspire. So we shift from the events of the birth and move into living our lives in service to that purpose for which we were created, exactly as Jesus did. Some of you may know a name, Robert Greenleaf. Have any of you ever heard of him? So I see a so-so out there. Robert Greenleaf retired as Director of Management Research for AT&T. He also was a guest lecturer at the business schools at the University of Pennsylvania and MIT and Harvard, both before and after he retired. He was also a practicing Quaker. And in 1970, he wrote an article entitled "The Servant as Leader." That article later grew into a book called Servant Leadership by Robert Greenleaf. And in the article and book, Robert Greenleaf moved the notion of servant leadership out of church and into the corporate world. Now, it's obvious to all of us that not all corporate leaders have bought into that notion, but it's out there. There's actually a website. If you Google Greenleaf leadership, you'll find it. There are lots of books and publications that speak to this whole notion of servant leadership. Greenleaf wrote, "Servant leadership begins when a person has the natural feeling and desire to serve. And only after having experienced and practiced that desire to serve comes the desire then to lead." He continues, "The best tests of servant leadership are these. Do those we lead grow as persons? And do those we serve become healthier, more free, and more likely to become servants themselves?" If any of you are familiar with the 12-step movement, that's precisely what the 12-step movement is about. The 12th step is about mentoring or serving. And it shares that wisdom in common with Greenleaf's understanding of servant leadership. And what Jim and I are going to do during this next series of sermons, beginning this morning, is to use Greenleaf's pamphlet entitled 7 Pillars of Servant Leadership, you'll see them up here, as a way to help us unpack servant leadership as embodied in the life and ministry of Jesus. The first pillar, or characteristic, if you wish, of servant leadership is this: a servant leader is a person of good character. Character is like the gyroscope in an ocean liner. If you've ever cruised, it's doubtful that you've ever seen the gyroscope. And the gyroscope is something few of us would ever have any reason to appreciate as long as the weather and the seas are calm. It is, for all practical purposes, invisible. But when the weather and the seas are rough and turbulent, then we can appreciate the gyroscope's work, whether we understand it or are aware of it or not. Because in difficult times, it is the gyroscope that enables the ship to maintain stability in rough seas. Character is like that. Character is that internal quality that we possess, out of which emerges that behavior, those patterns of behavior, which are characteristic of each of us. Now, for some people, that's negative. We talk about somebody, that person's a real character. And we may or may not mean it in a positive sense. But for our purposes today, as we look at pillars of servant leadership, especially as servant leadership as embodied in the life of Jesus, we're talking about that character out of which emerges Christ-like behaviors. Over the long haul, people begin to see us as those who embody, to one degree or another, behaviors that are dependable, that are trustworthy, that are caring, that are compassionate, and whether they identify them specifically with the life of Jesus or not, we are, in fact, at least a partial embodiment of Jesus in the world in which we live. Some of you remember dear Abby, Abigail Van Buren, the advice columnist. She said the best index to a person's character is how they treat people who can't do anything, who can't do them any good. How they treat people who can't do them any good. Another yardstick, she says, is how people treat others who are unable to fight back. People who have no recourse, people who have no resources, people who can do us no benefit, no good. How do we treat those people? John Wooden, the former coach at UCLA. If you remember, Jim preached a series of sermons on the wisdom of John Wooden. Wooden was a devout Christian man, and his wisdom was permeated with Christian values. John Wooden said, "Be more concerned about your character than your reputation. Your character is who you are. Your reputation is who other people think you are. Ideally, the two are hand in glove. But your reputation is infinitely more important." He went on to reveal that character is revealed most of all in what we do or feel when we're not thinking about it, or when we're under some kind of stress. Character is our internal value structure that guides the patterns of our behavior. So much for character. What about Christian character? Well, Christian character is revealed as we grow in single-minded, joy-filled devotion to God's will for our lives. when we care how God might have us respond to a set of circumstances, we are demonstrating that in the core of who we are, there is at least a seed of Christian character. As Christ's likeness is experienced in and through us by others, we demonstrate in an outward and visible way that character which lies at the source, our desire for Christ's likeness. The big question is, how do we shape that character? Well, it was interesting. As I read secular leadership literature, as I read a smattering of self-help books, and as I read Scripture, I found complete agreement. Together, they all agreed that the ability to endure hardships and challenge is essential for the cultivation of character. Now, hardships and challenges do not guarantee that a person will be a person of character. It depends on how one responds. But without exception, every source that I read, both sacred and secular, agreed that challenges and hardships of some degree are essential if a person is to experience character. That's really what our passage from Romans says. It says we know that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces Now, one more time, use your outside voice. Humor me. Suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character. You got it. You got it. Why does it seem there is so little character among decision makers in our culture? And true, it's there, but it seems to be what makes the headlines. Because we are a culture who prefers avoiding anything that challenges us, anything that might be difficult or painful for us, anything that might be new or uncomfortable. We want the short track to everything of value without realizing that we can have the trappings of an office or of a lifestyle, but we lack the substance that goes with it. And so we become, in the words of the poet T.S. Eliot, and pardon the gender-specific language, hollow men. We are a culture that wants to avoid anything that's difficult. We can't acquire character simply by reading about it or observing it. Although we can become aware of its presence or its absence in our lives, but in and of itself, that will not bring us character. We generally don't have to go seeking for the kinds of experiences that will bring us character. We simply have to live life and face what life brings instead of trying to avoid it. In a very real sense, character is forged. And I use the word forged because of the graphic implications. When we think of forge, we think of blacksmith, fire, heat, trial, and pressure. Now, it doesn't always have to be a life or death situation. Any of us who have raised children know that the way to begin cultivating character in children is to be sensitive to that which lies just beyond their ability and to support them in taking the risk. The older we get, the greater the risks. But it's no less a risk, and the challenges are no less essential. And the depth and strength of character, in my observation, is in direct proportion to what a person has endured with grace. And that with grace is really important, because challenges can also result in bitterness. Maybe you've heard the saying, the same sun that bakes the clay softens the butter. So the wisdom is a matter of how we choose to respond to the inevitable challenges that life will bring us. Life is structured to enable us to cultivate character, as long as we choose not always to take the easy way. And that in itself is countercultural. As we enter this new year, what if rather than avoiding life's challenges, we think of them as birth pains? What if, instead of avoiding the challenges that confront us, we say to ourselves, what is it that God is struggling to bring into existence through me if I will simply endure the discomfort? What if in this new year, as challenges come our way, we ask, where is God inviting me to serve? Or how is God asking me to make this world a better place? What if today, on behalf of the coming year, we are willing to commit ourselves to live lives of servant leadership by offering the challenges to God and embracing them as an opportunity to become strong in our character, that out of us might come a Christ-like example. That's a resolution worth making.